It was supposed to be just another flight, quiet, routine, forgettable. But before the plane even left the runway, the entire cabin would witness something they'd never forget. A confrontation so subtle at first, yet so revealing that it would later make headlines around the world. When the black woman stepped onto the plane, she carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from years of fighting battles nobody sees. Her suit was crisp, her expression calm, her briefcase engraved with two simple letters that would soon send shockwaves through the cabin, DW. But to the woman sitting in her seat, a white woman draped in designer red, lips painted bold as her entitlement, those letters meant nothing. She looked up, barely disguising her irritation, and dismissed the standing woman with a single glance. That look, cold, practiced, poisonous, spoke louder than words ever could. It said, "You don't belong here." The tension spread like turbulence. Passengers turned, pretending not to stare, their eyes flickering between discomfort and curiosity. Phones quietly lifted. A few exchanged whispers, the kind that carry judgment in every syllable. The flight attendant hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or stay invisible, but what no one in that cabin knew was that the woman they were silently watching wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't even there for leisure. She was the mind behind the very airline they were sitting on. The woman who built it, from the design of the seats to the technology powering the engines. And yet in this moment, none of that seemed to matter, because when prejudice takes over, credentials disappear, accomplishments fade. All that's left is the color of your skin and the assumptions people build around it. By the time the engines roared to life, the internet was already watching. A single video, a single moment of disrespect had begun to spread. But what happens next would turn shame into power and silence into a statement the whole world would hear. Because sometimes, justice doesn't need a courtroom, it just needs the right person in the wrong seat. For most people, flying was just a way to get from one place to another. But for Danielle Williams, it was something far more personal, a quiet reminder of everything she had fought to build. Every time she stepped onto a plane, she thought back to the little girl who used to stand at the airport fence, watching jets disappear into the clouds. Back then, she didn't see passengers or pilots. She saw freedom, a world far above judgment, where no one could tell her she didn't belong. Danielle grew up in the South, in a neighborhood where dreams were often smaller than survival. Her mother worked double shifts as a nurse. Her father fixed engines in a dim garage behind their house. Money was tight, but discipline wasn't. Her parents didn't believe in excuses, only effort. And that belief carried her further than anyone expected. By 32, she had earned dual degrees in aerospace engineering and business management. By 40, she had led teams that broke ground in aircraft efficiency and safety. And by 45, she had become something almost unheard of. A black female CEO of a major international airline. The board never wanted to announce her too loudly. Let the product speak for itself, they said. Danielle knew what that really meant. She'd been in too many rooms where her ideas were praised, until people saw her face. So she stayed behind the curtain, letting others take the spotlight while she did the work that kept the planes flying and the profits soaring. She didn't crave recognition, but she did crave respect. Today's flight was supposed to be simple, anonymous, a quiet journey from New York to Los Angeles, where she'd meet investors about expanding the airline's sustainable fleet. She booked the ticket herself, under an alias, D.W. Clark, to see what the average traveler experienced. She wanted to know if the airline's promise of equality and comfort was more than just marketing. Her morning had been smooth. A short drive, a smile from the driver, a fresh coffee she barely had time to finish. At the airport, she moved through security without fuss, blending into the stream of travelers. The uniform of success, tailored suit, discreet jewelry, sleek laptop bag, gave her away as a business professional, but nothing more. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Still, even in anonymity, she noticed the small things. The way the gate agent's tone shifted when she approached. The faint pause before scanning her boarding pass. The quick double glance at the ticket as if questioning whether she belonged in business class. It wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. But it never stopped stinging. Danielle had learned to let it roll off her shoulders. You couldn't fight every look, every doubt, every whispered assumption. You just kept walking, with dignity intact and head held high. As she entered the jet bridge, a faint hum of excitement filled the air. Passengers adjusted their carry-ons, parents soothed restless children, and the metallic scent of the aircraft mixed with perfume and recycled air. For Danielle, this smell, that blend of metal, air conditioning, and jet fuel, was strangely comforting. It meant progress. It meant movement. She glanced at her seat assignment. 2A, window side. A small luxury she rarely indulged in. She imagined herself sitting there, gazing at the clouds, reviewing her presentation one last time. For a moment, she allowed herself to exhale, but as she stepped into the cabin, she noticed something off. A blonde woman in a red designer dress sat confidently in 2A, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone as if she owned the place. Her handbag, a bright orange luxury brand, rested on the seat beside her. A glass of champagne sparkled in the cup holder, condensation slowly dripping down. Danielle hesitated, thinking perhaps she'd misread her ticket. She checked again. 2A, no mistake. The woman didn't even look up. The kind of indifference that came from years of being unquestioned. Danielle smiled politely, still calm. It was a small misunderstanding. Or so she thought. Behind her, a few passengers were already seated, watching discreetly. Some smiled back, some didn't. A few rows away, an Asian woman lifted her phone, pretending to check her messages but subtly recording. The flight attendants were busy settling others, unaware of the quiet tension beginning to form in row 2. Danielle stood still for a moment longer, her briefcase in hand. The initials DW gleaming faintly under the cabin light. She could feel it coming. That familiar weight in the air. The one that always preceded conflict not of her making. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated. Not the first time her place had been questioned. But something about this moment, this seat, this woman, this flight, felt different. The kind of different that whispered, this isn't just another misunderstanding. This was something the world was about to see. And as the engines outside began to hum, Danielle had no idea that by the time this plane landed, her name and this confrontation would shake the entire airline industry. Because sometimes, the most ordinary beginnings hide the storms no one sees coming. The air in row 2 turned heavy before anyone named it. The woman in red never met Danielle's eyes. She simply adjusted herself deeper into the stolen seat, staking a claim with posture alone. Around them, the cabin settled into that pre-departure hush where tiny sounds become magnified, belts clicking, zippers rasping, the low murmur of recirculating air. The bystander's camera held steady, catching every second that no one yet believed would matter. Danielle steadied her breathing the way she had taught herself during boardroom ambushes. She didn't need to dramatize anything. She only needed to remain undeniable. She placed her briefcase upright at her calf, slid her boarding pass under her thumb, and waited for the nearest flight attendant to finish stowing a garment bag. The attendant's smile carried the practiced warmth of someone trained to soothe without solving. She looked from Danielle to the seat, to the woman in red, then back again, quick, almost apologetic, as if asking for permission to avoid a problem. Danielle offered the pass with a simple nod, a gesture of polite clarity. The attendant's face remained pleasant, but Danielle felt the pause, that tiny delay where disbelief tries to negotiate with evidence. The attendant's tablet refreshed. Her expression softened with recognition, then tightened with something else. Calculation. Danielle recognized the arithmetic instantly. A visible passenger already settled. A standing passenger who might be asked to adjust. A hierarchy that would not be named aloud. The attendant promised to sort it out. The promise floated away like vapor. A second attendant arrived, then a lead, each compelled into the gravity of the moment. They hovered with professional grace, their whispers feather-light but sharp enough to cut. Danielle stayed still. The plane could wait. Dignity could not. The woman in red lifted her flute of champagne as though to toast a private victory. The condensation traced a wet ring on the armrest Danielle had paid for. She removed the handbag from the neighboring seat without invitation, then set it back down as if replacing a flag. She looked past Danielle toward the window, presenting the indifference of someone who never expects to be challenged. Behind them, the phones multiplied. Not just the first woman's camera. There were 3, then 5, then more, angles triangulating on an event the internet hadn't yet discovered. A teenager zoomed in from row 4. A man tied his sweater theatrically and pretended to stretch while recording. The cabin became a silent amphitheater. The lead attendant returned with the language of procedural error. There appeared to be an irregularity, she said. The system had assigned a duplicate seat. The situation would be quickly addressed, she said. Danielle listened to the cadence and not the words. The cadence favored quiet removal. The lead suggested they step aside to sort the matter. The offer held the gentle tug of displacement. Danielle did not move. She didn't raise her voice or point to the ticket again. Instead, she centered her feet, let the strap of her briefcase rest against her ankle, and focused her gaze on the front bulkhead. She had stood like this at countless thresholds, where the decision to stay or step back reshaped the floor beneath her. She stayed. The lead retreated and returned with an alternate plan, the way people return with bandages after deciding the wound must be yours. There was an open seat further back that would still be comfortable, she said, a temporary accommodation while the paperwork resolved. Danielle absorbed the suggestion like cold water. The seat was not merely a place on a plane. It was a contract, a boundary, a small, precise promise that said, you belong here exactly as much as anyone else. She declined with a silence that carried the dignity of an entire lineage. The delay rippled toward the cockpit. The captain's door remained closed, but messages began to shuttle between crew and flight deck like beads moving along a wire. In the terminal, a weather system had formed over the Midwest, and departure slots were tightening. Every minute now would count twice, once for the airline and once for the truth. Danielle felt the arithmetic tightening around her, too. The lead returned again, this time with a brightness that sounded rehearsed. A random secondary verification needed to be completed. Routine, she said. It was not routine. Random never seemed to select the passengers who arrived certain of welcome. They asked for additional ID. She offered it without flinching. They asked for the card used to purchase the ticket. She provided it. They requested the confirmation email. She produced it. Each proof landed gently on the attendant's palm and then disappeared into the tablet like coins fed to a machine that would never dispense change. The woman in red continued her quiet spectacle of comfort, stretching, adjusting, performing ease. She had become the still point around which the cabin turned, not because she belonged there more, but because everyone had been trained, consciously or not, to orbit entitlement. 2 rows back, a man in a tailored jacket glanced up from his newspaper and froze midway through recognition. Danielle recognized him, too, with the precise shock reserved for unsummoned ghosts. An investor. Not just any investor, the one who, years earlier, had praised her strategy in public, then starved her division of oxygen in private. He had used phrases like prudent caution to dismiss her fuel efficiency program, then later sold a similar idea as his own. He stared at her now with the unsettled curiosity of someone watching an inconvenient story step into the room he thought he'd booked for himself. His presence changed the math again. Danielle saw the future branching. One path where she surrendered the seat and disappeared into silence. Another where the decision set a precedent far beyond this cabin. The branch she chose would be witnessed not only by the bystanders with phones, but by someone who had profited from her invisibility. She steadied herself. The plane's systems hummed louder, as if sensing the alignment of engines and history. The lead attendant returned with a new request. A supervisor from the gate wished to review the boarding pass in person. Gate supervisors did not typically board for seat misunderstandings. They boarded when documentation became a weapon or when a passenger's dignity needed to be audited. Danielle passed the ticket again. The supervisor's first glance did not land on the seat number or the name. It landed on Danielle's face. The glance carried the clinical suspicion of someone trained to find flaws in the wrong subjects. The supervisor asked about the ticket class, how it had been purchased, whether there had been any upgrades or last-minute changes. Danielle answered simply, offering the facts like stones laid across a river. The supervisor tapped the tablet and made the kind of sound people make when they already know what they want to see. A message flashed in the cabin screens about turbulence expected after takeoff. Belts clicked in anticipation. But in row 2, the storm had already arrived, and it wasn't made of weather. The supervisor suggested, just for now, that Danielle wait in the galley while the paperwork cleared. The suggestion dressed displacement in courtesy again. Danielle felt the familiar ache of choosing between two unfair options: accept temporary removal to make others comfortable, or resist and become the problem. The ache was old and bone-deep, but she also carried something newer: time spent learning the airline's systems from the inside out. She knew what the manifest said. She knew what the personnel manual required. She knew who she was, even if anonymity had been her shield this morning. She didn't go to the galley. She didn't retreat down the aisle. Instead, she shifted her briefcase an inch closer to the leg of the seat. The initials caught the light again, DW unread by those who most needed to understand them. The woman in red finally looked up without hiding her irritation. She signaled toward the attendants with an expression that asked why this was taking so long. She had somewhere to be, her body language insisted. Time was a commodity she had always believed others should trade for her convenience. The cameras caught that look. The gold jewelry, the glossy perfection of someone certain that the world would rearrange itself to her schedule. The internet would later call it a familiar archetype. In the moment, it was simply one more weight pressing on the scale. Another message from the cockpit. Another whisper chain. The supervisor's voice tightened, and the next request arrived sharper. Danielle should step aside to avoid delaying departure. The phrase "to avoid delaying" sounded like a verdict disguised as concern. Danielle felt the sudden urge to justify herself, to inventory achievements, to offer credentials in exchange for the bare minimum. She resisted the urge with both hands. She thought of the airport fence from childhood, the jets lifting into a sky that didn't ask for papers. She did not move. Her stillness announced itself to the entire cabin the way thunder announces a storm's decision to start over your house. People leaned forward. The teenager in row 4 held his breath for more dramatic footage. The investor lowered his newspaper completely, calculating how this moment might later be narrated to shareholders. The supervisor lifted her chin with bureaucratic certainty and walked back toward the door to request support. The support arrived in the form of a security officer whose uniform had been designed to say calm while exerting quiet pressure. He positioned himself in the aisle with just enough proximity to change the air density. He spoke softly, but his presence shifted the story from a seat dispute to a potential security event, a metamorphosis that happens so often to black bodies that it barely needs a script. The officer asked for cooperation, which really meant surrender. Danielle watched the arc from inconvenience to escalation and understood that the next few seconds would decide not only the flight's schedule, but perhaps her own future at the company. It is a particular cruelty of racism that it forces its targets to perform grace for the comfort of the ungracious. She reached for the only tool the moment respected: knowledge. Without raising her voice, she asked for the manifest check that would confirm the name attached to 2A, the payment record that would validate the transaction, the operational policy requiring that documented seat assignments be honored absent safety or equipment change. She did not quote the section numbers aloud. She carried them in her posture. The officer blinked. He was not used to resistance that sounded like a flight operations briefing. The supervisor hesitated just long enough for the lead to step back in. The lead asked for a moment to verify some things. Verification replaced accusation the way a cloud sometimes slides in front of a hard sun. The officer stayed, but the pressure slackened a degree. That was when a subtle sound changed everything: the gate door opening again. A man in a navy suit hurried aboard with the restless energy of public relations. His badge swung from his neck. His smile tried to soften future headlines. Danielle knew his department by instinct: crisis containment. The PR director scanned the aisle and instantly found the phones. He met Danielle's eyes and looked away too quickly, then greeted the woman in red with the careful deference companies show to premium grievances. He whispered to the supervisor, then to the lead, counting liabilities under his breath. A message arrived on the devices. Departure window shrinking. 10 minutes. The PR director recalculated in real time. A voluntary swap could end the spectacle, he thought. A voucher could pacify. Offers began to flutter in the air. Lounge access later, bonus miles, a future upgrade. The offers landed on Danielle, not on the woman in red. Incentives to vacate her own space. It felt like being charged a fee to keep what was already hers. She didn't waver. The refusal was quiet but absolute. It moved through the cabin like a change in pressure. People sat straighter. Some felt relief at witnessing a boundary drawn so clearly. Others felt a subtler discomfort, the kind that appears when a familiar hierarchy fails to perform on command. The investor from 2 rows back stood, not to help, but to acquire proximity to the center of the narrative. He asked the PR director if the delay would affect connections. He glanced at Danielle again, measuring whether acknowledging her as a known quantity would end the scene or ignite a new one. He chose neutrality, a coward's refuge. The weather system tightened another notch over the radar. Slots vanished. The captain opened his door briefly, scanning the cabin with the brisk authority of someone accustomed to technical problems, not moral ones. He listened to a summary that used careful words and avoided dangerous ones. His eyes landed on Danielle's boarding pass, then on the woman in red's drink, then on the officer, then on the cameras. He closed the door without committing. The PR director read the room and tried a different angle, shifting empathy toward the woman in red, framing her as confused rather than entitled. Confusion offers redemption. Entitlement demands consequence. Cameras recorded everything. The flattering angle of apology directed at the wrong party, the way assistants traveled to comfort, not to justice. And then, as if summoned by the algorithms themselves, the first video from the bystander reached the outside world. A teenager's caption, a short clip, a freeze frame on the initials DW. Within moments, notifications began to ping in scattered pockets of the cabin. A passenger in row 7 widened her eyes, showing a friend the clip already accruing views. The PR director's phone vibrated with an internal alert, potential viral exposure. The math changed again, faster now. The supervisor reluctantly performed the manifest check at last. Her eyes moved across the lines with resignation. There it was, 2A attached to Danielle's alias. The record clean, the billing clear, the status confirmed. The supervisor exhaled the way people do when truth inconveniences them. She glanced toward the PR director, who weighed the cost of enforcing policy against the risk of offending someone who looked like a seasoned complainer with resources. He chose delay. He asked for one more moment. He wanted the problem to solve itself, for decorum to congeal around the old pattern. But the old pattern had caught the attention of the new audience, the millions waiting just outside the fuselage. Thumbs poised. Another ping, louder this time. The clip had been stitched by a small account with a large voice. Another day, another seat that mysteriously moves when a black woman is the one standing. The caption hooked, and the numbers climbed. The teenager in row 4 whispered a breathless update to no one and everyone. The woman in red shifted tactics now that inconvenience had begun to drip into her day. Her posture acquired a woundedness that sought allies. The crew, trained to comfort the loudest displeasure, leaned in with sympathetic nods. Danielle watched the story try to rewrite itself. Hers rendered disruptive, the other rendered delicate. It would be so easy for the narrative to calcify around that switch. She reached for her briefcase, not to leave but to retrieve a single sheet, a printed itinerary with the alias, the confirmation code, and the corporate discount routing that only employees and executive travel knew. She held it without flourish. The initials at the top matched the initials on the leather. The paper didn't announce her identity, but it explained her authority more convincingly than any speech. The lead finally squared her shoulders. She turned to the woman in red with a gentleness that nonetheless held steel. The decision had been made. The seat belonged to the person who had purchased it. It was a small sentence carrying a weight centuries in the making. The woman in red sat motionless at first, like a statue denied its pedestal. Then she smiled in a way that promised later retaliation, retrieved her handbag, and stayed exactly where she was. Compliance without movement. The performance of yielding without the act of yielding. She looked toward the security officer with a plea disguised as patience. Now came the moment racism so often saves for last, the institutional doubt that somehow remains even after proof has been offered. The supervisor spoke to the officer with a careful phrasing that gave him room to interpret the situation as unstable. Unstable can mean dangerous, and dangerous can justify removal. Danielle felt the floor tilt under her as if the plane had begun to taxi while stationary. A single misstep, a raised voice, a visible frustration could tip the narrative into the category that gets people escorted off flights. She kept her face a calm shore. Inside, her heart drummed against history. The captain's voice entered the cabin at last, the sound system flattening his tone into something soothing. He announced a short delay for paperwork. He did not say whose paperwork. The PR director typed furiously, sending updates to legal and operations. Somewhere in the terminal, a staffer pulled Danielle's employee record, then paused at the alias protocols, then escalated to an access list reserved for executives. The name appeared. The staffer blinked twice, then forwarded the confirmation uphill. In the cabin, the officer shifted his weight to one leg, as if deciding whether to anchor or withdraw. The woman in red watched him, hope flickering in the precise rhythm of someone accustomed to winning in the shadows of policy. The next notification hit like a soft explosion. The clip had found its way to an aviation blogger who specialized in industry accountability. He recognized the initials. He recognized the briefcase style. He recognized, perhaps, the rumor he had heard about a quiet executive traveling under an alias to do mystery audits. He tweeted nothing explicit, only a question that suggested the airline might be embarrassing someone it really shouldn't be embarrassing. The PR director saw it the instant it posted. His face shifted from professional calm to strategic alarm. He pulled the supervisor aside and spoke in a low cadence that replaced defensiveness with risk calculation. The supervisor's posture softened into accommodation. She exhaled the quiet apology people issue when they realize they have been performing the wrong script for the wrong audience. She approached the woman in red with a smile that tried to stay pleasant while delivering the word no. The woman in red smiled back in the way sharks grin, thin and lethal. She did not move. The officer glanced to the cabin cameras again, then to the bystanders. He weighed the optics of forcibly removing the wrong person versus gently encouraging the right person. Optics won. He asked the woman in red to stand. The request landed with the weight of inevitability at last. She stood, no longer lounging, her designer confidence hitting the oxygen like a flare and then fading. She huffed a performance of unjust inconvenience, collected her bag as if it were a child to be consoled, and shifted into the aisle. Applause did not break out. The cabin remained a hush of relief mixed with embarrassment. No one wanted the clip to show their faces cheering justice like a halftime show. Danielle stepped aside a half-inch to allow the movement. The officer nodded at her with a minimal respect that acknowledged resilience while withholding apology. The seat was finally open, and yet the moment did not feel like a victory. It felt like the bare minimum arriving late and under duress. Danielle placed her briefcase under the seat and settled in with a composure that masked the tremor in her chest. The window framed a slice of runway, the sky a pale wash beyond. She fastened her belt slowly, letting the sound click louder than necessary. It sounded like closure, but only partly. The captain announced an updated departure. The plane would push back soon. Relief skittered through the crew. The PR director checked his messages for permission to breathe. He didn't receive it. Instead, he received a flag from legal. If the passenger in 2A was who they now believed she was, an apology would need to be drafted, perhaps delivered in person upon landing, perhaps recorded. Damage flowed in one direction. Remedy must flow in another. Danielle stared at the seat back ahead and felt the weight of every small indignity she had not recorded. The moments that would never trend. The occasions when she had yielded to keep the world moving. She felt the hot wave of anger rise, not at the specifics of the seat, but at the economy of harm that keeps tally in private. She pressed her palms against the armrests, grounding herself. The plane began to move, but the story did not stop at the armrests. As the aircraft pushed back, the investor from 2 rows back leaned into the aisle a fraction, as if to catch her eye. He did not speak, he didn't need to. His gaze was an equation. How much did she see? How much would she tolerate? How much power did she have in this exact moment? He would soon learn. Taxiing slowed. Another delay. Weather reshuffled the deck again. A conga line of jets crept toward the runway. The cabin lights dimmed. People settled into the long wait with headsets and sighs. The phones stayed hot, burning tiny suns in dozens of hands. The bystander who had filmed the first clip now watched her metrics spike. Comments poured in from accounts that recognized patterns without needing names. Some asked why the airline had stalled. Some asked whether the woman in red had faced consequences beyond leaving a seat. Some demanded answers that could not be measured in miles or vouchers. Momentum converted curiosity into scrutiny. The PR director drafted statements he hoped he would not have to use. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. She inhaled the cabin air and thought of the blueprint meetings where she had designed touch points for dignity, wider aisles for smoother passage, softer lighting to reduce anxiety, training modules that emphasized empathy over efficiency. She had built these choices into the airline's DNA, insisting that hospitality begin with the assumption of belonging. And yet here, inside her own creation, she had been asked to prove worthiness for the right to sit where she had paid to sit. The irony cut clean. A small chime signaled an internal message. The lead glanced at her tablet in surprise, then at Danielle, with something like recognition shimmering through the layers. The message from corporate had reached her screen, an instruction to ensure that passenger 2A received any assistance needed. It did not say why. It did not include a title, but it carried the weight that turns requests into directives. The lead's eyes met Danielle's, and in that meeting something shifted, respect blooming not because of hierarchy, but because truth had finally found a path through the static. The taxi seemed to take forever. The plane paused at a holding point where the runway felt close enough to touch with a breath. Outside, thunderheads stacked into cathedrals. Inside, the tension rearranged itself into anticipation. Something else was coming. Everyone felt it without a word spoken. The officer disembarked quietly before takeoff, slipping away like an ending no one wanted to examine. The supervisor offered a thin nod to Danielle that attempted apology without naming failure. The PR director stayed in his jump seat, rehearsing phrases that would make corporate sound human. Just when it seemed the story would recede into the engine's roar, a ping erupted louder than the rest. The blogger had posted again, this time less coy. He hinted that the passenger in 2A might not only be important, but integral, that the airline owed more than a seat. Comments multiplied like raindrops on a windshield. Someone posted an old photo of a woman at a ribbon cutting, her face half turned, her initials visible on a briefcase. The resemblance was clear enough to spark a new wave of speculation. The investor saw the post. His cheeks colored with the quick shame of someone who realizes his past strategies might soon be evaluated by the very person they attempted to sideline. He settled back into his seat and began to plan an apology he did not feel. Danielle felt none of it. She had turned her phone to airplane mode without checking notifications. She chose stillness over spectacle for the final minutes before takeoff, saving energy for whatever waited beyond the clouds. The aircraft turned onto the runway. Engines rose to a pitch that rattled the heart into readiness. The wheels sprinted, then lifted, and in that moment Danielle experienced the sensation that drew her to aviation as a child. The clean break between ground and possibility. The city fell away. The cabin leveled. The seatbelt sign pinged softly. There are a sense that relieve and a sense that reveal. This one did both. The angle of climb gave the cabin a hush that felt like a held note. The attendants performed their choreography. The woman in red stared straight ahead, framed by a stubborn dignity that refused to learn. The bystanders revisited their clips, stitching and captioning. The truth continued to gather speed below the surface, like a current. When service began, the lead herself approached Danielle's row with care. She offered water with a steadiness that meant more than hydration. Her eyes carried a message that hovered between gratitude and concern. Danielle accepted the glass and let the cold trace a path down a throat still tight with unshed words. The lead asked if anything else was needed. Danielle considered asking for the thing policies cannot provide. Instead, she asked for time. Time arrived, cupped in the quiet of cruising altitude. And within that quiet came the realization that once the wheels touched down, there would be no going back to anonymity. The story had left the plane hours ago. It was circling the globe at the speed of outrage and recognition. The landing would not be a return. It would be a reveal. She looked out the window at a sky so calm it seemed incapable of holding the weight of what waited below. She thought of her mother practicing bandage wraps at the kitchen table, preparing to care for strangers. She thought of her father's hands, black with grease, coaxing engines back to life. She thought of every step that had carried her to this row, this seat, this moment where the smallest promise, honor the ticket, stood in for something larger, honor the person. The aisle rustled again as the PR director approached silently with a printed note. A message from corporate requesting a brief conversation after landing. He hovered, uncertain whether to break her solitude. He placed the folded paper on her armrest without a word and retreated like a tide. Danielle held the slip without opening it. She did not need to read what she already knew. The next chapter had begun the second the seat became a battlefield. She breathed in, slow and deliberate, and let the hum of the engines thread through her spine like resolve. And still, as the minutes ticked by and the flight coasted westward over storms that never touched them, a new unease threaded the cabin. The woman in red had not accepted the outcome. Her posture promised an aftershock. The investor had not decided whether to risk a greeting. The lead had not determined how to speak the truth in an industry that prefers euphemisms. The cameras slept, but not for long. Danielle placed the glass in the holder and rested her hand on the briefcase. The leather was warm from contact, the initials nearly hot against her skin. The symbol of her labor, her lineage, and her leadership sat like a heartbeat beside her. High above the weather, inside the vessel she helped design. She waited for the moment when the story would demand more than patience. Because the seat had been settled, but the reckoning had not. And when the wheels met the ground, the world would learn exactly who had been kept standing and why that could never happen again. The seatbelt sign flickered on again as the plane began its descent. But there was no calm. Only the heavy silence that follows after a storm has changed everything. Danielle sat still in 2A, her hands folded neatly over her briefcase, the initials DW glowing faintly under the soft cabin lights. She looked outward, but her reflection in the window looked back, a woman composed on the surface, carrying within her the tremor of something far larger than humiliation. At 35,000 feet, she had faced countless storms. But this quiet moment of degradation played out in front of 100 strangers, recorded, dissected, and shared. This was the one that would define what came next. The engines hummed their final descent tune, but the air felt thin. Her chest tightened as she heard whispers ripple through the cabin. The woman in red had begun again, louder now, weaponizing her embarrassment as outrage. "She's lying!" the woman's voice hissed, trembling but venomous. "This whole thing is a setup. I know how these people play the victim." Those words, these people, sliced through the recycled air like a blade. Even the engines seemed to stutter. Passengers turned sharply, some in disbelief, others pretending to focus on their screens. The bystanders who had filmed earlier looked up again, sensing the story was far from over. Danielle didn't flinch, but her heartbeat quickened. She had heard those words her entire life, rearranged in 100 subtle forms, in meetings, interviews, dinner tables. But never had they sounded this raw, this exposed. The flight attendant nearest to her froze mid-step, her smile dissolving into paralysis. The PR director, still in his jump seat, looked up sharply, phone in hand, his eyes darting between Danielle and the woman in red. He whispered something to the crew leader, who immediately began whispering back. Fear rippled through the aisles like turbulence, and then the captain's voice broke through, calm and professional, announcing their approach to Los Angeles. But beneath the surface calm, tension brewed, because when that plane landed, someone was going to answer for what had happened. The woman in red leaned closer, just enough for her perfume, expensive and sharp, to invade the air between them. "You think you can get away with this?" she muttered. "You people always pull the race card when you want attention. You'll see what happens when I call my lawyer." Danielle turned her head slowly, her voice calm, quiet enough for only the nearest few to hear. "Call whoever you need," she said softly. "Just make sure they know who built the plane you're sitting in." For the first time, the woman in red blinked, confusion flickering through her painted composure. The words hung there, suspended, unanswered, while the engines began to roar for landing, phones tilted upward again. That sentence, calm, controlled, factual, would soon become the title of millions of reposts. "I built this airline." The landing gear extended. The runway lights stretched toward them like a corridor of judgment. As the tires screeched against the asphalt, the passengers' relief was mixed with something electric. The awareness that they were part of a story larger than themselves. Every vibration of the descent carried tension. No one spoke, but every mind replayed the scene in silence. When the plane slowed to taxi speed, the crew unbuckled prematurely, the PR director first. His face had gone pale. He was already scrolling through his inbox, where dozens of internal alerts now blinked red. Someone had confirmed the rumor. The woman in 2A wasn't a passenger at all. She was their CEO. Danielle's phone buzzed inside her briefcase. She didn't reach for it. She knew the flood had begun. Calls from board members, reporters, perhaps even government officials. The story had outgrown her control, but she wasn't afraid. The seatbelt sign turned off. The woman in red stood abruptly, grabbing her bag with more force than grace. She turned to the crew. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge," she demanded. The PR director stepped forward, his tone even. "You already have," she frowned. "Excuse me?" The lead attendant's eyes flicked toward Danielle, who was now standing, briefcase in hand. Her presence commanded silence, not because she raised her voice, but because the air itself seemed to yield around her. Danielle turned toward the woman. "You wanted my seat," she said quietly. "But what you took was my dignity, and that is something I've spent my entire life earning back." The cabin went completely silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to retreat. The woman's face drained of color as realization dawned. Too late, too public. One by one, phones lifted again. The moment was being immortalized. The PR director cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said gently to the woman in red, "you'll be escorted off first." Her eyes widened. "Escorted off? Are you serious?" "She's lying!" But the words tangled in her throat as two airport officers stepped aboard, guided by the crew. Not police yet, but close enough to command authority. They didn't shout. They didn't touch her. They simply gestured toward the aisle. Every pair of eyes followed her as she was led away, her outrage shrinking to a whisper no one cared to hear. When the door closed behind her, the air changed again, heavier, truer. Danielle remained standing, still holding her briefcase, facing forward as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside, her chest throbbed with every suppressed emotion, anger, exhaustion, vindication, all braided into one sharp ache. The PR director approached cautiously. "Ms. Williams," he said, voice trembling, we didn't know." She met his eyes without blinking. "You didn't need to know," she said evenly. "You just needed to do what was right." He swallowed hard, shame burning behind his professional smile. "Corporate will reach out immediately. There will be statements, apologies." Danielle raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about what you let happen when you thought I was nobody." The words landed like thunder. By now, the rest of the passengers had risen, watching silently. some with guilt, others with awe. The bystander who had recorded the first video stood up, her phone trembling in her grip. "Ma'am," she whispered. "Thank you." Danielle nodded once, then began walking toward the front of the plane. Each step was slow, deliberate. The steady rhythm of a woman reclaiming every inch of respect that had been denied to her. As she reached the exit, the PR director followed, muttering corporate reassurances she barely heard. At the door, she paused and turned to the flight attendants. "You treat every passenger like they're someone important," she said softly, "because one day they will be." Then she stepped out, into the jet bridge, into the waiting storm. Outside, the terminal buzzed with chaos. Reporters had already gathered, flashes bursting like lightning. Security tried to form a barrier, but voices pierced through the hum. "Is it true you were on Flight 308? Did the passenger use racial slurs? Are you taking legal action?" Danielle didn't stop. She walked straight ahead, her heels clicking in rhythm with her heartbeat. Each step was a declaration, calm, controlled, unstoppable. But the storm followed. Cameras trailed her. Social media had already christened her the CEO who was told to move. Inside corporate headquarters, chaos was unfolding in real time. The boardroom lights burned bright despite the late hour. Screens displayed trending hashtags, angry statements, public calls for accountability. Stock analysts whispered about fallout. Legal counsel drafted apologies, and in the middle of it all, a single email hit every executive inbox simultaneously. From Danielle Williams. Subject, tomorrow's meeting. Its body contained only 3 words. "We talk now." Back at the terminal, the PR director caught up, panting. "Miss Williams, please. The press, the board, they're asking for guidance." "What should I—" She stopped him with a look. "You should start by listening." He fell silent. She continued walking until she reached the VIP corridor leading to the private exit. 2 guards stepped aside instinctively, not recognizing her as the same woman they'd ignored hours earlier. Power, it seemed, looked different once named aloud. As she approached the glass doors, she saw her reflection again, tired but unbroken. This time, there was no uncertainty. This was the moment she realized that being underestimated had given her something stronger than authority. It had given her proof. She opened the doors, stepping into the night air. Her phone buzzed again, hundreds of messages, missed calls, notifications. One stood out, a simple text from her mother. "I saw what happened. You handled it with grace. Your father would be proud." For the first time since the plane took off, Danielle's composure cracked, a single tear tracing her cheek, hot and silent. She didn't wipe it away, because this wasn't a moment of weakness. It was release. She took a deep breath, looking at the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the runway. The night smelled of rain and jet fuel, the scent of every fight she'd ever survived. And somewhere deep inside, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just address the board. She would address the world. Not as a CEO protecting an image, but as a black woman reclaiming a narrative. The next day came like an earthquake. Cameras flooded the company lobby. Employees gathered in the atrium as Danielle stepped onto the stage. Dressed in the same cobalt suit she'd worn on the flight. Unaltered. Unapologetic. She stood behind the microphone and let the silence stretch until even the restless clicking of cameras stopped. "I wasn't supposed to tell this story," she began, her voice steady, echoing through the hall. "Because people like me are told to stay silent, to protect the brand, to avoid making others uncomfortable. But yesterday, on my own airline, I was told to give up my seat. Not because of a ticketing error, but because of a perception that I didn't belong." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Executives shifted uneasily in their chairs. "I built this company on the idea that everyone deserves dignity when they fly," she continued. "But dignity doesn't start with policies, it starts with people. With how we look at one another, with what we assume before we even speak." She paused, scanning the faces before her, many of whom had benefited from her work, few of whom had ever truly seen her. "I was invisible until I became an inconvenience," she said, "and that That is what must change. Her voice rose now, not in anger but in power, in truth. Racism doesn't always wear a badge or shout across a room. Sometimes it smiles, apologizes, and asks you to move for convenience. But every time we allow that to happen, we tell the next generation that silence is safer than standing tall. The audience was motionless, every word cut with precision, slicing through excuses, exposing the rot beneath the surface of civility. Danielle placed her briefcase on the podium, the DW initials gleaming under the lights. "I don't want apologies," she said. "I want accountability." And then with calm finality, she added, "Starting with us." The room erupted, not in applause, but in murmurs and shifting, in the uneasy awakening of a system forced to confront itself. Outside, millions watched the live broadcast. Her name flooded every timeline, every news site. The clip from the flight now looped side by side with her speech. "That's my seat!" On one half, "I built this airline," on the other. The contrast was staggering. That night, journalists called it the turning point. But for Danielle, it wasn't about headlines or heroism. It was about reclaiming something she'd been denied for too long, her own humanity. As she walked off the stage, the PR director approached again, his voice trembling. "Ma'am, what should we tell the media now?" She smiled faintly, eyes steady. "Tell them the truth," she said. "For once." He nodded, tears threatening. Outside, the city roared with noise, protests, praise, and debate. The world had seen the ugliness unfold, but it had also seen something rarer: grace under fire. Danielle looked up at the night sky, where a jet crossed overhead, her airline, her legacy, soaring above the same clouds that had once carried her humiliation. And in that moment, she realized something profound. Justice doesn't always arrive with fury. Sometimes it arrives in the calm, unwavering voice of someone who refuses to move. As the roar of engines faded into the distance, she whispered to herself, a line no camera caught, no crowd heard. "They took my seat for a moment, but they'll never take my place." And with that, she walked back into the storm she was born to calm, the world still trembling from the truth it had just seen. Morning arrived without asking permission. It came with the gray light that slips between tall buildings and the steady clatter of a city that never pauses for anyone's ache. Danielle woke before her alarm, not because she had slept well, but because her body understood that certain days begin before you are ready. The cobalt suit hung over the chair like a flag no one could misread now. The briefcase rested on the desk, initials warm in the light. The world had already decided to call her by the moment it found most cinematic. She decided to answer with the life that made that moment possible. The first hours after the incident were a blur of statements and timelines and requests to frame the story in softer light. She did not soften it. She offered the truth the way the runway offers the wheels: firm, unbending, necessary. The company posted an apology. She insisted it not be written in passive voice. The board scheduled an emergency session. She scheduled a conversation with staff who had to live inside the policies the board only touched. The investor who once found her ideas risky sent a message laced with sincerity and self-preservation. She filed it beside a long archive of similar notes and gave it no special power. By noon, her name trended in places where aviation never trends. People who had never flown on her airline recognized her face and repeated a single sentence like a landing mantra. She built this. The phrase circled the globe, shaped by admiration and anger and the uneasy relief of those who could finally point to an example and say, "Here, look, this is what it is." Not the screaming headline version, not the nightstick, not the siren, but the quiet, ordinary cruelty that asks a black woman to move and believes itself courteous for asking. In the hours that followed, the company did what companies do in the aftermath of a visible wound. It investigated. It drafted policies that should have already existed. It rearranged the hierarchy of consequences so that the next gate supervisor would be trained to recognize dignity before discomfort. But Danielle knew organizations do not change because a memo tells them to. They change because a story leaves them no place to hide. So she made the story bigger than the seat that started it. She asked for a public commitment to metrics that could not be massaged, incident tracking with racial breakdowns, response times, escalation thresholds, independent audits, discipline that traveled upward as easily as it traveled down. She asked for training designed by those who endure bias, not by those who only study it. She asked that every apology be paired with a policy revision, every revision with a deadline, every deadline with a public clock. She did more than ask. She put her name on the clock. Inside the company's halls, a shift could be felt in the small places where culture hides. The crew lounge bulletin board traded laminated talking points for a printed letter written in plain speech and signed with initials everyone now recognized. The scheduling software pushed a new requirement before any shift could be accepted. A short module that did not teach customer service techniques as much as it taught a discipline of recognition. To read the posture of harm, to refuse the ease of stereotypes, to understand that the fastest solution is not the fairest one. Cabin crew who had learned to survive on politeness received permission to practice courage. Ground staff who had been measured by time to turn learned they would also be measured by time to trust. It was not a revolution not yet, but it was a recalibration, and recalibrations change landings. Outside the company, the impact took on its own velocity. The first wave was outrage. It came in black banners and thread-long testimonies, in memories from people who had been asked to step aside in airports and banks and foyers and living rooms, who finally had a public window through which their private humiliations could be seen. The second wave was action, petitions, boycotts, internal pressure campaigns, think pieces that were more than think. Activists who had been building the scaffolding of accountability for years extended it around the airline and then beyond it. Civil rights groups requested meetings not to extract platitudes, but to embed protections. Regulators hinted at new guidance. Competitors pretended to have nothing to learn until their own customers reminded them otherwise. Somewhere in the white noise of commentary, the woman in red became a symbol. Some wanted her name released. Others argued she was already too known by type. Danielle refused to feed that fire. This was not a story about a single villain any more than her career had been the result of a single act of generosity. The point was not to ruin a person. The point was to repair a pattern that ruins lives. She kept the lens where it belonged, on the structures that allow small harms to scale. At home, the emotional cost arrived more quietly. It sat between breaths. It appeared in the way her hands shook slightly when she reached for coffee the next morning. It lingered when she closed her eyes and replayed the cabin hush, the hesitation, the glances, the instruments of protocol turned against the very ethos she built. It would have been easy to pretend resilience makes you immune to residue. It does not. Resilience lets you walk while carrying it. She did not pretend. She called her mother and listened to the kind of silence only a nurse understands. The silence that comes before truth that will heal. The truth was simple. The incident had changed her, but not in the way humiliation intends. It had stripped away the last, thin layer of accommodation she once believed necessary to lead in peace. It had exchanged it for a fiercer peace, the kind that refuses to shrink to fit the room. She returned to work with that peace set like a stone at the base of her spine. The next week, she convened a town hall on the maintenance floor. Not the executive auditorium where acoustics flatter hierarchies, but the place where the skin of the planes meets the hands that keep them safe. Mechanics lined the walls in blue coveralls. Baggage handlers leaned against pallet jacks. Cabin cleaners stood near the back, tired but curious. She spoke without slides, without branded phrases. She described the incident in simple terms and then described the system she expected them, and herself, to build. It was a system where a passenger's dignity would not yield to anyone's status, where suspicion would never be the default setting applied to black bodies, where the fastest way to calm a situation would always be truth, never displacement. That day, she made promises with dates. In 90 days, she would publish a quarterly dignity report with redacted details and unredacted numbers. In 60 days, a rapid response channel would be staffed by people trained to distinguish conflict from bias. In 30 days, A cross-departmental council, pilots, gate agents, cleaners, analysts, crew, would be empowered to veto any policy that punished appearance while protecting entitlement. If the council could not reach her, it could reach the chair of the board. If the board did not listen, the council could go public. She designed the plan with the humility of an engineer who knows that systems must be strong enough to survive the very people who design them. The council formed. The report launched. The channel rang. Patterns surfaced in the data as clearly as air routes on a map, who was most often flagged for verification, where incidents clustered, which scripts produced fairness and which produced harm. The transparency did not solve everything, but it made denial expensive. And expensive is a language institutions suddenly understand. In the space beyond corporate action, the story did its quieter work. Parents used it to teach their children about dignity that does not require permission. Teachers used it to mark the difference between politeness and equity. Frequent flyers paid attention to what they had not noticed before. The way staff greeted one passenger with ease and another with doubt. The way a request transformed into a demand when the speaker felt certain they would be believed. The way silence sat heavy on people who had learned that speaking leads to punishment. Some began to intervene. The intervention did not always look like heroics. Often it looked like the smallest leverage, an offered seat while the real seat was defended. A voice that asked the right question before security was summoned. A refusal to record for spectacle and a decision to witness for truth. Danielle's speech to the broader industry came 2 months later, at a conference where men often outnumbered conscience. She stood under the kind of stage lights that try to turn people into brands, and spoke instead as a builder. She described the seat as a promise, not a privilege. She described anonymity as a flawed safety that black professionals are often forced to purchase with their own silence. She described the way bias masquerades as policy and how the disguise can be removed. She did not name her airline more than once. She named the stakes again and again. After the speech, executives approached with handshakes that lasted a beat too long, with plans to borrow the ideas they had resisted before the cameras turned. She knew the choreography. She did not waste it. She handed them the framework anyway, the way a pilot hands coordinates to another crew in the same storm. Some would use it. Some would perform it. She could not control either. She could only keep the pressure steady and the light on. The woman in red lingered in the cultural imagination like a shadow. A few outlets tried to make her the headline again. The story did not cooperate. Instead, attention shifted to crew members, who admitted privately that they had been trained to avoid conflict by moving the person least likely to fight back. The admission landed harder than any single face could. It revealed a habit that would break only with practice and consequence. The company began that practice. The consequences started to travel where they belonged, up. For Danielle, the deepest resolution did not arrive on a stage or in a report. It came on a quieter flight weeks later, when she boarded under her own name and watched the small mechanisms of hospitality perform exactly as designed. A gate agent greeted her without clocking her race as a variable to be managed. A passenger gave way in the aisle without the calculus of who deserved space. A flight attendant glanced at a seat dispute 2 rows back and resolved it by checking the manifest first, not the faces. The moment was so ordinary it glowed. Normalcy is the last best prize of justice. She still carried the incident in her bones. A body remembers the cold ink of humiliation. It also remembers the heat of reclaiming. When she thought of the girl at the fence watching jets rise into belonging, she finally saw a clear line between that child and this woman. The line did not avoid turbulence. It cut through it. It carved a lane for others. Impact takes many forms. Some of it is visible: press conferences, new badges, training budgets ratified in public meetings. Some of it is invisible: the gate agent who now pauses before doubt, the supervisor who writes a different note in a personnel file, the customer who decides that intervention is part of the ticket price. Some of it is stubborn: policies that ossify again, executives who assume the storm has passed and the sky no longer needs tending. She expected the stubbornness. She built for it. The broader meaning settled slowly on those who watched from afar. People told and retold the story not because it was theatrical, but because it was familiar. They recognize the narrow aisle of everyday life, the seat someone tries to take with a smile, the way authority arrives and points in the wrong direction. They recognize the choreographies learned in families and schools and offices, the scripts that say, avoid confrontation. Be grateful. Yield the small thing to save the large one. The story offered an alternative script. It said, the small thing is the large one because it teaches the world how to treat you, and it teaches the world who you are. In forums and living rooms and break rooms, a reframing happened. People stopped asking whether the incident counted as real racism, as if only overt cruelty qualifies. They started asking how many moments like this had been allowed to pass unnoticed because they did not contain shouting. They asked what had been lost each time: confidence, time, safety, the simple ease of belonging, and what could be built in its place if vigilance replaced denial. The answers were not uniform. They were honest. Honesty is fertile ground. The company's first quarterly dignity report landed with numbers that chastened and encouraged. Verified seat disputes had dropped. Response times had improved. Incidents categorized as random verification now required a named reason and a signature that could be audited. Complaints from black passengers decreased in some hubs and increased in others. Proof not that harm had grown, but that people had learned to trust the channel. A graph does not capture everything, but it can point where to dig. Danielle treated each spike as both a warning and an invitation. She did not become a saint in the public imagination. She refused that posture. She was a leader who had been wronged and had chosen to use the wrong as leverage. She remained stubborn about the things that build planes well: checklists, maintenance, redundancy. She applied the same thinking to culture. A single training session is not enough. You need recurrent. A single apology is not enough. You need inspections. A single charismatic speech is not enough. You need an operating manual anyone can follow even on bad days. Closure, when it came, did not look like a door slamming or an enemy vanquished. It looked like a long exhale at cruising altitude, the kind you let out when you trust the crew and the craft. It looked like a workplace where a young analyst who looked like her younger self felt comfortable being brilliant without padding brilliance with apology. It looked like an elderly passenger in economy who received the same explanation and respect as a celebrity in first. It looked like the ordinary miracle of fairness, performed without fanfare until the day it no longer feels like a miracle at all. She knew the arc of the story would be shortened in headlines. The internet likes the moment it can meme. It is less patient with the months required to make systems safe. That impatience is part of why injustices recur. She decided to ignore it. She taught her teams to love the part of justice that is unglamorous, to take satisfaction in fewer incidents that no one will praise them for preventing, to measure success not by trending peaks, but by flat lines where harm used to spike. In private, she tended to the part of herself that had been scraped raw. She walked early in the mornings when the city still had its soft edges. She kept a notebook by the window and wrote the things that must not be shared until they have cooled. She called old friends who knew her before any title and let them make her laugh in ways no podium ever allows. She loved the people who steadied her and let herself be loved. Healing is mostly maintenance, too. Before the next annual meeting, she asked for a small change to the agenda. After the financial results, after the fleet updates, she wanted one slide reserved for the dignity metrics, not as a separate values section, but as part of performance. Revenue and respect side by side, each with a line that could rise or fall. The board agreed because it would have been awkward to say no. The real victory was not their agreement. It was the precedent. Every year thereafter, someone would have to answer for those numbers aloud. Someone would be asked why a line dipped. Someone would know that the world could see. This is how impact survives beyond a headline. You weld it to the places where organizations feel it. By the time the anniversary of the incident arrived, life had resumed its clipped rhythm. New stories had seized the nation's attention. Other storms had rotated across the landscape of injustice. She understood the cycle. She refused to be cynical about it. Attention moves. Work remains. She chose the work. On the morning of that anniversary, she visited a small regional airport near her childhood home. No press, no speeches, just a walk along the fence where she had once watched wings lift into possibility. The chain links were the same. The future felt closer. A little girl stood there now, fingers hooked through the metal, eyes tracing a jet that rose into the blue. Danielle did not introduce herself. She did not need to. She simply stood nearby long enough to hear the intake of breath that children make when the world shows them its size. She left a note with the airport education office later, funding a scholarship for girls who wanted to study the science that makes lift out of weight. The life-altering moment on that plane had not turned her into something she wasn't. It had clarified what she already was and what she refused to be. Invisible, apologetic, safe for the comfort of those who confuse kindness with concession. It had revealed to millions what many already knew in their bones, that racism is not only the loud thing, it is the arrangement of small things that make someone else's comfort more precious than your belonging. And it had offered an answer smaller than a revolution, but large enough to matter. The daily insistence on keeping your seat and, by doing so, keeping yourself. For those who watched and felt their own scars throb, the resolution is an invitation, not a finale. There will be other aisles and other moments when the room rearranges itself to make you smaller. There will be bystanders who film and bystanders who intervene. There will be officials who arrive already certain of the wrong story. What you do then will not always trend. It will still count. It will count in the heart you steady, in the policy you force to be written, in the child who learns that dignity is not a luxury. If you carry power, the invitation is different. Build systems that catch harm upstream. Measure what you would rather not measure. Make fairness part of performance, not public relations. Train for courage, not just compliance. If you carry only your voice, you carry enough. Ask the question that slows the rush to remove. Offer the seat while the real seat is defended. Be the witness who refuses to turn truth into spectacle. The story ends where it began, in a seat that was never just a seat. A small rectangle of space on a moving machine promised to a person who paid for it in money and in years. That promise was broken in front of strangers. That promise was repaired because one woman refused to choose comfort over truth. The world watched. Some learned. Some changed. Some did not. The sky did not shift color. Planes continued to rise. What changed, finally, was the expectation. In 1,000 cabins and corridors, people who once hesitated now check the manifest first. People who once filmed without thinking now think about what to do with the power of a lens. People who once carried resignation like a passport now carry something else beside it, a readiness built from seeing what happens when you stand. She did not become a symbol by choice. She became proof of concept, that calm can be radical, that policy can be made from pain, that dignity is a design decision as much as a moral one. If you have ever been asked to move from the place you earned, remember this. The seat is small, but the stand is large. And every time you keep it, you widen the aisle for someone who is watching and learning how to keep theirs. The question that remains is simple and impossible to ignore. The next time the world makes a quiet request that steals something essential from someone else, will we choose speed or will we choose justice? Choose justice. Share this story. Tell your own. Name the pattern when you see it. Hold power to its promises, and when the moment comes, because it will, keep your seat.